The glass shattered against the wall, inches from Eliza's face, and she did not even flinch anymore. "You will wear this gown tonight," Margaret said, her voice flat and cold as winter stone. "Or you will not eat for a week. Choose." Eliza looked at the dress laid across her bed. It was cut too low, too tight, too red for a girl still mourning her father. She knew exactly what her stepmother wanted. Margaret wanted every eye at the Duke's winter ball to land on Eliza and see nothing but shame. "Yes, stepmother," Eliza said quietly, because there was no other answer that would not end in something worse than a broken glass. 6 months ago, her father had been alive, and this house had been warm. Now the halls felt like a cage built of cold marble and colder smiles. Since his death, Eliza had gone from beloved daughter to unwanted burden, sleeping in the small room near the servants' stairs while Margaret's 2 daughters, Vivian and Clara, took over the finest rooms in the house. The Harrington fortune, left in trust until Eliza married, sat just out of Margaret's reach, and that single fact made Eliza dangerous to her. A trust that would pass to a husband the moment Eliza said her vows. Margaret could not steal it. She could only make sure Eliza never had the chance to marry a man who would protect her. "You understand what happens tonight," Margaret said, stepping closer, straightening a pin in Eliza's hair with a grip that pulled more than it helped. "Lord Pemberton will find you in the gardens. People will see. Your reputation will be finished by morning, and no respectable family will ever want you. You will belong to this house forever, exactly where you should be." Eliza said nothing. She had learned over the long months that silence was safer than argument, but inside, something small and stubborn refused to break. Her father used to tell her that courage was not the absence of fear, it was walking forward despite it. She held onto those words like a candle in a dark room. The carriage ride to Ravenshallow Hall was long and silent, except for Vivian's occasional laugh at some private joke shared with her sister. Eliza sat by the window, watching the countryside blur into darkness, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had heard whispers about the Duke of Ravenshallow her whole life, though she had never seen him. They called him the Beast of Ravenshallow behind closed fans and cupped hands. A man who never attended society events, who hid himself away in his enormous estate, whose face, they said, had been ruined by fire years ago. Some claimed he never smiled. Others claimed he never let anyone close enough to find out. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, he was hosting a ball. All of London wondered why. The hall itself took Eliza's breath away despite everything weighing on her heart. Candlelight poured from every window, golden and warm against the winter dark, and music drifted out into the courtyard like something from a dream. For one small moment, stepping out of the carriage, Eliza allowed herself to feel something other than dread. She allowed herself to feel wonder. It did not last. "Remember," Margaret whispered against her ear as they crossed the entrance hall, "the gardens near the East Fountain. Lord Pemberton knows to wait for you there. Do try not to make it difficult." "I have no wish to go anywhere with Lord Pemberton," Eliza said, low and firm. Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. It was never a request. Inside the ballroom, Eliza felt every gaze slide over her red gown and then away as though people were embarrassed on her behalf. She caught snatches of whispered words. "Poor girl, look at that dress." Her stepmother again, no doubt. She held her chin high and tried to disappear into the edges of the room, near the tall windows, where the crowd thinned and the music felt farther away. It was there that Lord Pemberton found her first, an hour before Margaret's plan called for it. He was not a handsome man, though he clearly believed otherwise. His smile was too practiced, his eyes too sharp beneath their charm. He held 2 glasses of wine and offered one to Eliza with a small bow. "Miss Harrington, you look as though you'd rather be anywhere else tonight." "Perhaps I would," Eliza said carefully, not taking the glass. "Come now, a walk in the gardens might improve your mood. The night air is lovely this time of year." His eyes flicked toward the terrace doors, and Eliza understood with a cold drop in her stomach that he was eager to begin Margaret's plan early, before anyone might interfere. "I would rather stay inside, my lord." I insist. His hand closed around her wrist, not gently. Panic rose fast and sharp in Eliza's chest. She glanced around the ballroom, but no one seemed to notice, or if they did, no one cared enough to intervene. Lords and ladies swirled past in their silks and laughter, blind to a girl being pulled toward the terrace doors by a man twice her strength. "Let go of me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to pull free without causing a scene that would only make things worse for her later. "Don't be difficult, Miss Harrington. I only wish to talk." He pulled her through the terrace doors and into the cool night air, past a hedge that blocked the view from the ballroom windows, toward the darker paths of the garden where the party's noise faded into distant music and rustling leaves. Eliza's heart pounded. She twisted her wrist hard, finally breaking his grip, and stumbled backward into the shadows of an overgrown archway. "Stay away from me," she said, breathless, backing further into the dark. Lord Pemberton laughed, low and unpleasant. "Where will you run, exactly? Into the hedges. Your stepmother made it very clear you'd cooperate." Eliza's blood went cold. He knew. He had been told exactly what tonight was meant to be. She was not imagining the danger. She turned and ran, deeper into the garden, past fountains and dark rose bushes, her slippers slipping on the damp stone path, until she pushed through a set of glass doors into what felt like the only warm, lit room she could find. It was a conservatory, full of tall plants and the quiet drip of a small fountain, lit only by moonlight through the glass ceiling above. She pressed her back against a stone pillar, chest heaving, listening for footsteps behind her. "You should not be running through a man's private conservatory in the dark," said a voice from the shadows, deep and quiet, "unless you intend to break something." Eliza spun around, startled, nearly losing her balance. A tall figure stood near the far wall, half hidden by the leaves of a large fern, one side of his face turned deliberately away from the moonlight. "Forgive me," she managed, still catching her breath. "I did not mean to intrude, I was only—" She stopped, unsure how much to say to a stranger. "Running from someone," the man finished for her, his voice flat, unreadable. "I heard him calling your name in the garden. Lord Pemberton, I believe." "Yes." Eliza swallowed hard, embarrassment and fear tangled together in her throat. "He would not let go of me." Something shifted in the stranger's posture, subtle but unmistakable, like a coiled spring drawing tighter. "Stay here," he said simply, and walked past her toward the terrace doors. Eliza caught only a glimpse of his face as he passed through a shaft of moonlight, and she understood all at once exactly who stood before her. The burned scars along the right side of his jaw and temple were unmistakable, pale and old, the kind of mark that only came from great and terrible fire. This was the Duke of Ravenshallow himself, the man the whole of society whispered about, and none of them had actually seen in 5 years. He stepped out into the garden. Eliza heard Lord Pemberton's voice, then a sharp exchange of words too quiet to make out clearly, and then silence, followed by hurried footsteps retreating toward the house. When the Duke returned a few minutes later, his expression gave nothing away. "He won't trouble you again tonight," he said simply. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, still trembling slightly from the fright of it all. "I don't know what I would have done." "You were doing quite well on your own. You outran him halfway across my gardens." There was the faintest note of something in his voice, not quite amusement, but close to it. "I am Eliza Harrington," she said, because it seemed only right to introduce herself to the man who had just helped her, even if half of London would have fainted at the mere sight of his scarred face up close. "I know who you are," he said. "Everyone in that ballroom knows who you are tonight, Miss Harrington. Your stepmother made certain of it." Eliza's cheeks burned with humiliation. "I did not choose this dress. I did not choose any of this evening. I did not imagine that you had." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady despite the scars that pulled slightly at one side of his mouth when he spoke. "You should return inside before you are missed. Take the side corridor, not the terrace. Fewer eyes." "And you?" Eliza asked, surprising herself with the question. "Won't you come inside as well? It is your ball, after all." Something like a shadow crossed his face. I prefer the dark, Miss Harrington. It suits me better than candlelight. She wanted to argue, wanted to say that the dark could not hide a kindness like the one he had just shown her, but the words felt too bold for a stranger, however grateful she was. Instead, she offered a small, honest smile. Then I thank the dark, Your Grace, for putting you in my path tonight. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face that might have been surprise, or perhaps something gentler, before he turned his scarred side back into shadow, as though from long habit. Go inside, Miss Harrington, he said quietly, before your stepmother comes looking. Eliza slipped through the side corridor exactly as he had instructed, her heart still racing, though not entirely from fear anymore. She had no way of knowing, as she smoothed her hair and rejoined the edge of the ballroom crowd, that the encounter in the conservatory had already been seen by more eyes than she realized, and that by morning the story would not be the one Margaret had planned at all. It would be far bigger, and far more dangerous for everyone involved. By morning, the whole of London seemed to know. Eliza woke to the sound of her stepmother's voice rising through the house like a storm breaking, sharp and furious, though not for the reason Eliza expected. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Margaret pacing the drawing room, a folded newspaper crushed in her fist, Vivian and Clara watching from the settee with wide, delighted eyes. "What have you done?" Margaret hissed the moment Eliza appeared in the doorway. "I don't understand," Eliza said honestly, glancing between the three of them. Margaret threw the newspaper onto the table between them. Eliza picked it up with trembling hands and read the words printed in bold ink across the society page. Miss Eliza Harrington, seen alone in the private conservatory of the Duke of Ravenshallow, in circumstances that can only be described as most compromising. The Duke, it seems, has finally found reason to leave his solitude behind. Her stomach dropped. This isn't true, nothing happened. He only helped me, he sent Lord Pemberton away, that is all that occurred between us. It does not matter what occurred, Margaret snapped. It matters what people believe occurred, and they believe you spent the evening alone with a man in a dark conservatory, unchaperoned for who knows how long. For one strange, dizzying moment, Eliza almost laughed. This was meant to be her stepmother's plan, her ruin arranged carefully with Lord Pemberton in the garden. Instead, fate had twisted the plan into something else entirely, something Margaret had never intended and could not control. "You wanted me ruined," Eliza said slowly. "Does it truly matter whose hand accomplished it?" Margaret's face went pale with fury. "It matters a great deal, you foolish girl. Lord Pemberton was meant to compromise you quietly, privately, in a way I could manage. A duke, seen with you in his own home at his own ball, printed in every paper in London by morning. This is not ruin I can control. This is a scandal that reaches all the way to the palace steps." She pressed a hand to her temple as though the very thought pained her. The Duke of Ravenshallow does not simply walk away from something the papers have already declared a compromise. He will be expected to act. "Act how?" Eliza asked, though some small, frightened part of her already understood. She did not have to wait long for her answer. Before noon, a carriage bearing the Ravenshallow crest arrived outside the Harrington townhouse, and the butler announced, in a voice tight with disbelief, that His Grace the Duke of Ravenshallow requested an audience with Lady Margaret and Miss Eliza Harrington. Eliza's hands shook as she smoothed her plainest gown, the only one Margaret had not yet taken away from her, and followed her stepmother into the drawing room. The Duke stood near the window when they entered, tall and composed, dressed in dark, unadorned clothing that made no attempt to soften the impression he gave. He had turned his scarred side slightly toward the wall, an old habit, Eliza guessed, though he did not hide his face entirely. "Your Grace," Margaret said, sweeping into a deep curtsy, her voice suddenly honeyed and warm, all trace of the morning's fury vanished beneath practiced charm. "What an unexpected honor." "Lady Margaret," his voice was even unreadable. "Miss Harrington." He inclined his head toward Eliza, and something in his gaze softened just slightly before returning to its careful neutrality. "I imagine you have seen the papers this morning," he continued, addressing the room generally. "I will not waste time pretending otherwise. Miss Harrington's reputation has been damaged by what was printed, regardless of the truth of the matter, and I hold myself partly responsible for the circumstances that led to it." "Your Grace is too generous," Margaret said quickly. "Truly, there is no need." "There is every need," he said, and something in his tone made even Margaret fall silent. He turned to Eliza directly. "Miss Harrington, I have come to offer marriage. I will not pretend this is born of romance, or that I know you well enough to claim affection. It is a matter of honor and of practicality. My name can shield you from a scandal that would otherwise follow you for the rest of your life. In return, I ask only that you consider the offer seriously, and answer honestly, whatever your answer may be." The room went utterly silent. Eliza stared at him, her mind spinning too fast to settle on any single thought. Marriage. To a duke she had met only hours ago in the dark, under circumstances neither of them had chosen. And yet beneath the shock she felt something else, something she could not quite name. He had not asked because he wanted the Harrington fortune, she realized. A duke of his wealth had no need of it. He had asked because he felt responsible, because some part of him believed it was the right thing to do, even at great cost to his own solitude. "Eliza," Margaret said, her voice suddenly sharp with warning, "surely you understand the honor being offered to you." But it was not Margaret's approval Eliza sought in that moment. It was some quiet certainty inside herself, some voice that sounded very much like her father's, reminding her that courage meant walking forward despite fear. "May I ask you something first, Your Grace?" Eliza said. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly hidden. "Of course." "Why truly did you come here today? You could have let the scandal pass. Dukes have survived worse gossip than this. You did not have to offer marriage to a stranger." For a long moment, he said nothing, and Eliza wondered if she had overstepped, if she had ruined whatever fragile chance stood before her. Then he spoke, quiet and low, meant only for her, though the room was small enough that everyone heard. "Because last night you thanked the dark for putting me in your path. No one has ever said such a thing to me before. I find I would rather not be the reason darkness follows you as well." Something inside Eliza's chest loosened. Some tight and frightened thing she had carried for months finally easing, just slightly. She thought of her small room by the servants' stairs, of Margaret's cold cruelty, of a future with no protection and no escape. And she thought of a man who had chased away danger without asking anything in return, who stood before her now offering safety not out of desire for her fortune, but out of some quiet code of honor she was only beginning to understand. "I accept your grace," she said. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was almost lost beneath the sound of the Duke's slow, careful exhale, as though he too had been holding his breath, uncertain of her answer. "Then it is settled," he said. "I will make the necessary arrangements. The wedding will take place within the fortnight quietly at Ravenshallow Hall." After he left, Margaret rounded on Eliza with an expression of such fury and disbelief that Eliza almost stepped backward instinctively. "Do you understand what you have done?" Margaret hissed. "You are to become a duchess. You, the daughter I have kept in the servants' quarters for 6 months, will outrank me in every room we ever enter again." "I did not plan this," Eliza said quietly. "You did, you set the trap, stepmother. I only survived it." For the first time since her father's death, Eliza watched something like fear flicker behind Margaret's cold eyes, quickly buried beneath fresh anger, but not quickly enough to hide entirely. Margaret had built her entire plan on the assumption that Eliza would remain powerless forever. Now, through no true design of anyone's making, that assumption had been shattered, and Margaret would not forgive her for it. Eliza did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the small, cracked ceiling of her narrow room, turning over everything that had happened in the span of a single day. She thought of the Duke's scarred face turned carefully toward shadow, of his quiet, steady voice, of the strange gentleness beneath his guarded manner. She did not know him. She did not love him, but for the first time in 6 long months, she felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. She felt hope. Whatever waited for her at Ravenshallow Hall, whatever kind of man truly lived behind those careful walls and old scars. She intended to find out for herself, on her own terms, without her stepmother's schemes standing between them ever again. She could not have known, lying awake in the dark that night, that Margaret was already planning her next move, already writing letters, already searching for some new thread to pull that might unravel everything Eliza had just, against all odds, managed to save. The wedding took place on a gray morning, in a small stone chapel on the Ravenshallow estate, with only a handful of witnesses standing in the cold. There were no crowds, no cheering, no grand celebration such as most brides might dream of. Eliza wore a simple pale gown, her hair pinned plainly, and stood beside a man she had spoken to only twice in her life. Margaret attended, of course, along with Vivian and Clara, all three dressed in their finest, smiling for appearances while their eyes remained sharp and calculating. Margaret had not given up. Eliza could see it in the way her stepmother watched the Duke throughout the ceremony, measuring him, searching for some weakness she might exploit later. When the vicar pronounced them married, the Duke, Adrian, took Eliza's hand gently, his grip careful, as though he feared she might pull away. She did not. His hand was warm despite the cold air of the chapel, and for one strange moment, standing there with strangers' eyes upon them, Eliza felt something settle inside her chest, quiet and unexpected. Not love, not yet, but something that might, given time, grow into it. They did not speak much on the carriage ride to Ravenshallow Hall. Adrian sat across from her, his face turned toward the window, the scarred side kept carefully angled away from her gaze, though Eliza found she did not mind looking at it. She had seen far uglier things in 6 months living under her stepmother's roof than a few marks left by an old fire. Ravenshallow Hall itself rose out of the winter landscape like something from an old story, gray stone and tall windows, ivy climbing the walls in dark green ribbons even in the cold season. It was beautiful in a quiet, solemn way, much like its master. The staff greeted them at the entrance, a modest household for a duke of his standing, Eliza noted. An older housekeeper named Mrs. Bellamy stepped forward first, her expression warm despite its formality. "Welcome to Ravenshallow, Your Grace," she said, curtsying to Eliza with obvious sincerity. "We are glad to have a lady in the house again." Something in the way she said it, the slight catch in her voice, made Eliza wonder how long it had been since Ravenshallow Hall had known a woman's presence at all. Adrian showed her briefly through the main rooms of the house, his manner polite but distant, offering short explanations without elaboration. The library was here, the drawing room there, her chambers down this corridor, his own study and rooms in the east wing, separate from hers. "You will want for nothing," he said, standing at the door to her new chambers. "Mrs. Bellamy will see to anything you require. I have matters to attend to in my study." "Adrian," Eliza said, using his given name for the first time, testing the shape of it. He paused, something flickering across his face at the sound of it. "Thank you, for everything you have done. I know this was not the marriage either of us imagined for ourselves." "No," he agreed quietly. "It was not." And then, without further explanation, he turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the doorway of a house that was now, somehow, her own. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Eliza rose early, as she always had, out of long habit rather than necessity now that she had servants to attend her. She explored the grounds, walked the overgrown gardens that clearly had not been tended with much care in years, and slowly began to learn the house that had become her home. Adrian remained a mystery, wrapped in careful distance. He took his meals alone in his study more often than not, and on the rare occasions they dined together, he spoke little, keeping his scarred side turned toward the shadows of the candlelight, watching her with a wary sort of attention that Eliza found she did not entirely mind. There was something honest in his caution, something that felt less like coldness and more like a man bracing himself against a pain he expected to come, sooner or later, the way it always had before. She began to notice small things about him during those quiet, careful weeks. He preferred his tea without sugar, taken quickly, as though he did not wish to be caught lingering over something so ordinary as comfort. He read late into the night, based on the candlelight she sometimes saw beneath his study door when she passed on her way to bed. He avoided mirrors, she noticed, in every room of the house, and she began to understand, slowly, painfully, just how deeply the scars had marked more than his face. One afternoon, exploring the west wing of the house, Eliza found a locked door at the end of a narrow corridor, half hidden behind a heavy curtain, as though someone had wanted it forgotten entirely. She asked Mrs. Bellamy about it that evening, over tea in the small sitting room the housekeeper had begun to share with her in quiet moments. Mrs. Bellamy's face grew solemn. "That was the young master's room, your Grace. His Grace's younger brother, Master Edmund. It has stood locked since the fire." Eliza set down her teacup carefully. "The fire that scarred him." "Yes, your Grace." Mrs. Bellamy hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking they were truly alone. "It happened 7 years ago now. A terrible thing. The east wing caught fire in the night, and Master Edmund was trapped inside his rooms. His Grace went in after him, though every servant in the house begged him not to, though the flames had already taken half the wing by the time he reached the doors." "Did he save him?" Eliza asked, though something in the housekeeper's expression already told her the answer before the words came. "He tried, your Grace. He carried his brother out himself, through fire that took the skin from half his own face and arm doing it. But Master Edmund had already breathed too much smoke. He did not survive the night, despite everything his Grace tried to do." Eliza sat in silence for a long moment, her chest aching with a grief that was not hers to carry, and yet somehow felt heavy all the same. She thought of Adrian's careful distance, his mirrors avoided, his scarred face turned always toward shadow, and understood, finally, that he did not hide from the world because he feared their disgust. He hid because every reflection, every startled glance, reminded him of a night he had failed to save the person he loved most, no matter how hard he had fought the flames to reach him. "He has never spoken of it to anyone since," Mrs. Bellamy continued softly. "Not to the staff, not to his own mother before she passed 2 winters ago, God rest her. He blames himself, your Grace, though anyone with sense can see there was nothing more he could have done. He went into that fire when braver men would have stood back and let the walls fall." That night Eliza could not sleep. She lay awake thinking of the locked door at the end of the West Wing corridor, of a young man's rooms left untouched for 7 long years, gathering dust behind a curtain no one dared to move. She thought of Adrian sitting alone in his study each evening, carrying a grief so heavy he could not even look at his own reflection without seeing it reborn. She rose before dawn the next morning and found her way, quietly, to the small chapel on the estate grounds where they had been married only weeks before. The gardener, an elderly man named Old Tam, was already at work near the chapel walls, and Eliza asked him, gently, whether the gardens near the east wing might be restored. "Been asking for it myself for years, your Grace," Old Tam said, scratching his weathered chin. "His Grace never gave the order, though, not since the fire. Said it wasn't worth the trouble or some such. I think it pains him too much to look at, truth be told." "I would like to try," Eliza said, quietly, "without troubling him unless he asks." Over the following days, Eliza began small changes throughout the house, careful, unhurried, the kind of gestures that asked nothing in return. She had the neglected rose bushes near the east wing gardens pruned back and cared for, though she left the burned section of the old wing itself untouched, understanding instinctively that some wounds needed to heal in their own time. She left a book of poetry she thought he might enjoy on the small table beside his favorite chair in the library, never mentioning it, simply leaving it there and walking away. She began sitting with him during his solitary evening teas, not speaking unless he did, simply offering her quiet presence as company, the same way she might sit beside someone in mourning, understanding that some grief needed witness more than words. Adrian noticed, of course. Eliza saw it in the way his shoulders eased slightly when she entered a room now, the way his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary before he caught himself and looked away. He did not speak of it directly, not yet, but something between them had begun to shift, slow and careful, like ice thawing at the edges of a long winter pond. One evening, nearly a month into their strange, quiet marriage, Eliza found him standing at the edge of the East Wing Gardens, staring at the newly pruned rose bushes she had ordered restored. He did not hear her approach until she was standing beside him. "You did this," he said, not quite a question. "I hope I did not overstep," Eliza said carefully. "Old Tam told me the gardens had been neglected a long while. I thought perhaps something beautiful growing here might do more good than letting it stay wild and forgotten." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the roses, his scarred profile lit softly by the last of the evening light. "My mother planted these," he said finally, his voice rough, "before the fire. She used to walk here every morning." "I did not know," Eliza said softly. "I am sorry if I have disturbed something that was not mine to touch." "No," he shook his head slowly. "No, I think she would be glad to see them growing again." He turned to look at her then, fully, without turning his scarred side away for the first time since she had known him. "Thank you, Eliza." It was the first time he had said her given name without formality, without distance, and something in the sound of it, spoken so plainly in the quiet evening air, made her chest ache with a warmth she had not expected to feel so soon, for a man she had married under such strange and unwanted circumstances. Neither of them could have known, standing together in the fading light beside Rose's newly returned to life, that far away in London, Margaret was already sharpening a new blade meant for both of them, a plan built not of gardens and quiet kindness, but of forged papers and carefully planted lies, patient and cold, waiting only for the right moment to strike. A scream tore through the stables just after dawn, sharp enough to send birds scattering from the rooftops of Ravenshallow Hall. Eliza was already dressed, walking near the paddocks with her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill, when she saw the young stable boy stumbling backward from one of the stalls, his face white with fear. She hurried forward and saw at once what had frightened him. One of the carriage horses, a large gray gelding named Storm, had somehow gotten his leg tangled in a length of loose rope, and in his panic to free himself, he had begun kicking wildly, striking the wooden stall walls hard enough to splinter them. "Fetch his grace," Eliza said quickly to the trembling boy, but she did not wait for anyone else to act. She had grown up around horses on her father's smaller estate before his death, and something in her recognized that every second of delay risked the animal breaking its leg entirely. She approached slowly, speaking low and steady, the way her father had taught her years ago. The horse's eyes rolled wide with fear, his powerful body straining against the rope wound tight around his fetlock. "Easy," she murmured, edging closer despite the danger of flailing hooves. "Easy now." She had nearly reached the tangled rope when strong hands closed around her shoulders and pulled her firmly backward, away from the stall. "Are you mad?" Adrian's voice was sharp with alarm, his grip firm but careful as he set her a safe distance away. "He could break your skull with one kick." "He is going to break his own leg if someone does not free that rope," Eliza said, breathless but steady. "I have handled frightened horses before, Adrian. I know what I am doing." He looked at her for one long, searching moment, some battle playing out behind his eyes before he gave a short nod. "Stay back regardless." "Let me." He moved toward the stall with a calm, measured confidence that surprised her, speaking to the horse in the same low, steady tone she had used moments before, his scarred hand outstretched slowly, patiently, until the animal's wild eyes began to settle, just slightly. It took several long minutes, the horse still snorting and shifting nervously, before Adrian managed to work the rope free from the tangled fetlock, stepping back quickly as the gelding shook himself and stamped, but stood calm at last, no longer thrashing. Eliza let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You are good with him." "I spent most of my youth in these stables," Adrian said, running a steadying hand along the horse's neck. "Easier company than most people I found." "I understand that better than you might think," Eliza said quietly, and something in the honesty of it made him glance at her again, longer this time, as though seeing something new. They walked back toward the house together afterward, the early morning mist still clinging low to the grass, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the quiet companionship of the walk. It was the longest conversation they had shared since the wedding, easy in a way neither of them had expected, drifting from horses to childhood memories to small, ordinary things neither had spoken of before. "You surprised me back there," Adrian admitted as they reached the terrace steps. "Most ladies of your upbringing would have screamed and fainted rather than walked toward a panicked horse." "I am not most ladies," Eliza said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "I spent years managing a smaller household before my father passed. Fear rarely solves anything in my experience. Only steady hands do." "Steady hands," he repeated softly, glancing down at his own scarred one before tucking it briefly behind his back, an old habit she was beginning to recognize. "I have not always trusted mine to be steady enough." "I trust them," Eliza said simply, and watched something shift behind his careful expression, something warm and startled and cautiously hopeful, before he cleared his throat and looked away toward the house. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Adrian invited her to dine with him in the main dining hall rather than retreating to his study alone. The long table, meant for grand feasts and dozens of guests, felt almost absurd set for only the two of them, candlelight flickering between empty chairs. But Eliza found she did not mind the quiet intimacy of it at all. "Tell me about your father," Adrian said partway through the meal, surprising her with the directness of the question. Eliza set down her fork, considering. "He was a kind man, patient. He taught me to read long before most girls learned their letters because he said a mind left empty grows only weeds. He loved this land, much the way I imagine you love yours." She paused, memory tightening briefly in her chest. "He married Margaret 2 years before he died. I do not think he ever truly knew what she was capable of, beneath the charm she showed him." "I am sorry," Adrian said quietly, "for everything she has put you through." "You saved me from the worst of it," Eliza said. "Whatever this marriage began as, Adrian, I am grateful for it, truly." He studied her for a long moment across the candlelight, his scarred cheek catching the golden glow without him turning away from it this time. "I did not expect to feel grateful for it as well," he admitted, "and yet I find that I am." It was a small admission, quietly spoken, but it settled into the space between them like the first true crack in a wall built brick by careful brick over 7 long years. Eliza felt her heart lift with something dangerously close to happiness, something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. 3 days later, a letter arrived from London that shattered the fragile peace they had begun building. It came addressed to Adrian directly, sealed with Margaret's personal wax stamp, and Eliza watched from across the breakfast table as his expression darkened while he read it, his jaw tightening, the warmth of recent days draining slowly from his face. "What is it?" she asked, alarm rising in her chest. He set the letter down carefully, though his hand was not quite steady. "Your stepmother writes to inform me that your father's estate carries debts she was previously unaware of. Debts she claims must now be settled by his heir, given that his fortune has passed, through you, into this marriage." Eliza's stomach turned cold. "That cannot be true. My father managed his affairs carefully. He left no debts behind, I am certain of it." "She has included papers," Adrian said slowly, "bearing what appears to be your father's signature." "Forged," Eliza said immediately, firmly. "I know my father's hand as well as I know my own, Adrian. Whatever she has sent you, it is not genuine." He looked at her for a long moment, and Eliza held her breath, some old fear rising in her chest that he might doubt her, that Margaret's careful lies might poison even this fragile new trust they had begun building between them. But instead, he nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said simply. "I will have my solicitor examine the documents closely. If they are false, we will find the proof of it." Relief flooded through Eliza so suddenly it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not need to thank me for believing you, Eliza," Adrian said, something gentle and unfamiliar softening his voice. Trust should not require gratitude between people who wish each other well. But even as he spoke the reassuring words, a small, cold unease settled in Eliza's chest, a feeling she could not quite shake through the rest of that long day. Margaret did not send idle threats. Whatever forged papers she had crafted were only the opening move in a much larger game, and Eliza understood, with growing dread, that her stepmother would not stop until she had found some way to tear apart the fragile happiness beginning to grow behind Ravenshallow's gray stone walls. Thunder cracked so loudly overhead that Eliza nearly dropped the candle she carried, the flame guttering wildly before steadying again in her cupped hand. The storm had rolled in fast that evening, faster than anyone at Ravenshallow Hall had expected, turning the sky black and violent within the span of an hour. Rain lashed against the tall windows in furious sheets, and somewhere in the distance, a tree groaned and cracked, falling with a sound like a gunshot across the estate grounds. The household staff had retreated to their quarters early, candles extinguished against the danger of the storm, leaving the great house dark and echoing with the fury outside. Eliza could not sleep. She had never feared storms as a child, but something about the violence of this one, the way the old house shuddered faintly with each roll of thunder, pulled at old memories she preferred not to revisit. She made her way down the main staircase, candle in hand, intending to find a book in the library to distract her racing thoughts. Light flickered beneath the study door at the end of the corridor. She hesitated only a moment before knocking softly. "Come in," Adrian's voice called, low and tired. She found him seated near the fireplace, a glass of untouched brandy on the table beside him, his coat discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows, staring into the flames with an expression so distant and haunted that Eliza's chest tightened at the sight of it. "I could not sleep," she admitted, stepping inside. "The storm." "Nor could I," he said, though something in his voice told her the storm outside was not the only one keeping him awake. "Sit, if you like. The fire is warmer than the rest of the house tonight." She settled into the chair across from him, close enough that the firelight lit both their faces equally, no shadows for him to retreat into this time. For a long while neither of them spoke, listening to the rain hammer against the windows, the fire crackling low and steady between them. "It was a night like this one," Adrian said finally, so quietly Eliza almost missed it beneath the thunder. 7 years ago, the fire. Eliza went very still, afraid that any movement, any sound, might close the door he had just tentatively begun to open. "You do not have to speak of it," she said gently. "Not unless you wish to." "I have never spoken of it," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Not truly, not the whole of it to anyone." He was quiet a moment longer, his jaw working, before the words began to come, slow and rough, like something long buried finally breaking free of the earth. "Edmund was 17, my younger brother. Bright, restless, always laughing at things I found no humor in at all. He used to say I was born 40 years old, too serious for my own good." A faint, pained ghost of a smile crossed his scarred face. "The fire started in the east wing near the old library. No one ever discovered exactly how. A candle left too close to the curtains, most likely. By the time anyone raised the alarm, half the wing was already burning." Eliza sat perfectly still, her heart aching with the weight of what she could see coming, though she said nothing, only listened. "I ran toward the fire before I even understood what I was doing," Adrian continued, his voice growing rougher still. "The servants tried to stop me. My father was away in London that week, and there was no one else to make the decision, so I made it myself. Edmund's rooms were at the very end of the burning corridor. I remember the heat first, how it felt like walking into the mouth of something alive. I remember calling his name and hearing him call back, coughing, frightened. He closed his eyes briefly. I found him collapsed near his window, half conscious from the smoke already filling his lungs. I carried him out through the flames myself. I do not fully remember doing it, if I am honest, only fragments, the heat, the pain, though I did not feel it fully until much later. His weight in my arms and how light he felt, how frightened that made me." "You saved him," Eliza said softly. though something in his expression already told her the ending of this story was not the one she wished it to be. "I got him out of the house," Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time. "I laid him on the grass beneath the stars, and for one moment, one terrible, brief moment, I believed we had both survived it. And then he simply stopped breathing, Eliza. The smoke had already done its damage before I ever reached him. There was nothing more I could have done, the physician told me later, again and again, as though repeating it enough times might make me believe it. But I have spent 7 years believing that if I had only run faster, reached him 1 minute sooner, he might still be alive today." Tears gathered silently in Eliza's eyes, and she made no attempt to hide them. "It was not your failure," she said, her voice fierce despite its softness. "You ran into a burning house for him, Adrian. You carried him out through flames that scarred your own body forever. That is not the story of a man who failed his brother. That is the story of a man who loved him enough to risk everything and lost him anyway, through no fault of his own." "Everyone tells me that," he said, staring down at his scarred hands resting in his lap. "And still I cannot look in a mirror without seeing his face beside mine, asking why it was him and not me who survived that night whole." Eliza rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling beside his chair so that she could look up into his face properly, without the shadows he so often hid behind. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away if he wished, she reached up and gently touched the scarred side of his jaw, tracing the old marks with careful, tender fingers. He went very still beneath her touch, his breath catching audibly, but he did not pull away. "These are not marks of failure," Eliza whispered. "They are proof of everything you tried to do, proof that you loved him enough to walk through fire itself rather than lose him without a fight. I would rather love a man brave enough to carry those scars than one who never risked anything at all." Something broke open in his expression then, some final wall crumbling that Eliza suspected he had built and rebuilt for 7 long years, brick by careful brick, against exactly this kind of tenderness. His hand rose, trembling slightly, and covered hers where it rested against his scarred cheek, holding it there as though he feared it might vanish if he let go too soon. "Eliza," he said, her name rough and broken on his lips, carrying more weight than she had ever heard in it before. "I am here," she said simply, "for as long as you wish me to be." They stayed like that for a long while, the fire burning low, the storm gradually softening outside the tall windows, neither of them speaking, simply existing together in the quiet, fragile intimacy of a truth finally spoken aloud after 7 long years of silence. When Adrian finally spoke again, his voice had steadied, though something in it had changed permanently, softened in a way Eliza suspected few people had ever heard from him before. "I did not expect this," he admitted quietly. "Any of it. This marriage began as an act of duty, Eliza. I offered for you because I believed it was the right thing to do, not because I imagined anything more might grow from it." "And now?" Eliza asked, her heart beating fast in her chest, some fragile, hopeful thing unfurling there despite every instinct telling her to guard against disappointment. "Now," he said slowly, his thumb tracing gently along her knuckles where their hands remained joined against his scarred cheek, "I find myself grateful, every single day, for whatever strange twist of fate led you into my conservatory that night. I do not know precisely what this feeling is that has grown between us these past weeks, but I know I have not felt anything like it in 7 long years, and I am no longer certain I wish to fight against it." Eliza felt tears rise again, warmer this time, born of something far gentler than grief. "I think," she said softly, "that it might simply be the beginning of love, Adrian, slow and careful and perhaps a little frightened of itself, but love nonetheless." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something open and unguarded and achingly hopeful. "I think you may be right," he said finally, and when he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, Eliza felt the last of her own careful defenses dissolve entirely. The storm outside gradually quieted into a soft, steady rain, and they remained together by the fire long into the night, Speaking of small things now, childhood memories and favorite books and quiet hopes for the gardens come spring. The heavy weight of old grief finally lightened, if not entirely lifted, by the simple act of being truly seen and accepted by another person for the first time in far too long. In the weeks that followed, the change between them became impossible for the household to ignore. Mrs. Bellamy caught herself smiling more often than she had in years, watching her master actually laugh, at something Eliza said over breakfast one bright winter morning. Old Tam noted that his Grace had begun walking the newly restored gardens each evening, no longer alone, his scarred face turned toward the sunlight rather than away from it, his young wife's hand often tucked companionably into the crook of his arm. Adrian began joining her for every meal now, their conversations stretching long into the evenings, filled with easy laughter and quiet confidences neither of them had expected to share so freely. He showed her his late mother's private sitting room, untouched for years, and together they slowly began restoring it, not to erase the past, but to honor it properly rather than leaving it locked away in dust and silence. He read poetry aloud to her some evenings, his voice warm and unhurried, no longer rushing through moments of comfort as though he did not deserve them. Eliza, in turn, found herself falling deeper into something she had never expected to find within a marriage born of scandal and obligation. She loved his quiet intelligence, the dry wit he revealed only once he trusted someone enough to show it, the gentle way he handled every fragile, frightened creature that crossed his path, whether horse or grieving housekeeper or a stepdaughter's daughter no one else had thought worth protecting. She loved that he never once flinched from difficult truths, that he had told her the whole of his brother's death without softening it into something easier to bear, trusting her enough to witness his grief fully. One evening, walking together through the restored rose gardens as the sun set gold and soft across the estate, Adrian stopped beneath the largest of his mother's old rose bushes, now blooming fuller than it had in 7 long years, and turned to face her fully, without a trace of his old careful distance. "I have something to ask you," he said, "though I confess I am somewhat nervous asking it." "You may ask me anything," Eliza said, smiling up at him. "This marriage began between us as an arrangement," he said slowly, "born of scandal and duty rather than choice. But I find, standing here now, that I would choose you again, Eliza, freely and completely, if given the chance to do it all over. I love you. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude for what you have done for this house or for me, but simply because you are you, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it any longer." Eliza's breath caught, joy rising so suddenly and fully in her chest that she could barely find her voice to answer him. "I love you too, Adrian," she said finally, her own voice thick with emotion. "I did not expect to, not so quickly, not under such strange circumstances. But I do completely, and I would choose you again as well, 100 times over in any life." He kissed her then, properly, fully, beneath his mother's roses in the fading golden light, and for the first time in 7 long years, Adrian, Duke of Ravenshallow, felt something in his chest that resembled true happiness rather than mere endurance against old grief. Neither of them noticed the carriage that passed slowly along the distant road beyond the estate walls that same evening, nor the sharp, calculating eyes watching the scene from behind its curtained window, cataloging every detail of the couple's obvious happiness with cold, growing fury. Margaret had come to see for herself exactly how far her stepdaughter's fortune had risen, and what she saw only strengthened her resolve. The forged debt papers had failed to shake the Duke's trust. She would need something far more damaging than paper lies to tear this marriage apart, and as her carriage rolled onward toward London, already turning over new and darker possibilities in her mind, she began to understand exactly what that something would need to be. The letter arrived on a bright spring morning, delivered by a private courier rather than the usual post, and Eliza noticed at once how carefully it had been sealed, as though whoever sent it wished to ensure no curious servant might read it first. She was in the garden when Mrs. Bellamy brought it to her, cutting fresh flowers for the sitting-room table, humming softly to herself in a way she had not done in years before her marriage. The housekeeper's expression, usually so warm these days, carried a shadow of unease as she handed over the sealed envelope. "This came for his grace, my lady," she said, "but the courier insisted it be delivered directly into his hands, and he is away in the village this morning, meeting with his solicitor. I did not know quite what to do with it." Eliza took the letter, recognizing Margaret's careful, elegant handwriting at once, and felt a familiar cold unease settle in her stomach. She set it on the hall table to await Adrian's return, though she found she could not stop glancing toward it throughout the long morning, some instinct warning her that whatever it contained would not bring good news. Adrian read it alone in his study that evening, and Eliza, passing the door some time later, noticed it stood slightly ajar, his expression visible through the gap, tight and troubled in a way she had not seen since the very first weeks of their marriage. She knocked softly, and he looked up, quickly folding the letter and setting it aside, though not quickly enough to hide the darkness that had settled over his features. "What is it?" she asked, stepping inside despite the wariness suddenly radiating from him. "Nothing that concerns you," he said, his voice carrying a coldness she had not heard directed at her in weeks, a coldness that struck her like a physical blow after so many recent evenings of warmth and easy affection. "Adrian, please. If something troubles you, I would rather know than watch you carry it alone." He was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, something guarded and searching that made her chest ache with old, familiar fear. Finally, he slid the letter across the desk toward her, watching her face carefully as she read it. The words on the page turned Eliza's stomach, cold with disbelief and fury. Margaret's elegant hand had woven an entirely fabricated story, claiming that Eliza had confided in her, in private letters exchanged between stepmother and stepdaughter, that she found her husband's scars repulsive, that she had only married him for his title and fortune, that she mocked his appearance to her old London friends in cruel, private jokes whenever his back was turned. The letter included supposed quotes, cruel words dressed up in Eliza's voice, words she had never spoken, never even thought in her entire life. "This is a lie," Eliza said, her voice shaking with fury and hurt in equal measure. "Every word of it, Adrian. I have never written to my stepmother since our wedding, not once. I have never spoken of your scars to anyone except with love and admiration for what they represent. You know this. You have seen it with your own eyes these past months." "Have I?" Adrian's voice was quiet, but something dark and wounded lay beneath it, old scars of a different kind rising to the surface. "I have seen what you have shown me, Eliza. I do not know what passes between you and your stepmother when I am not present." "Nothing passes between us," Eliza said, desperation rising sharp in her chest. "I despise her, Adrian, you know this. She tried to ruin me, she has sent forged debt papers against my father's memory, and now this more lies, crueler still. Why would you believe her, over everything we have built together these past months?" "Because I have spent my whole life being the man people whispered about behind closed doors," Adrian said, his voice rough with old, buried pain finally breaking free. "The scarred duke, the beast who let his own brother die. I have heard every cruel word imaginable said about my face, my grief, my worth as a man. Some small part of me has always expected it to come from you eventually as well, no matter how much I wished it would not." "Then that fear is not truly about me," Eliza said, tears rising hot and fast now. "That fear belongs to every cruel person who has hurt you before, Adrian. I am not one of them. I have never given you reason to believe I am." But even as she spoke the words, some cold, creeping doubt had already settled into Adrian's expression, old wounds reopened by Margaret's careful poison, and Eliza watched, helpless and heartbroken, as the warmth that had grown so steadily between them these past months began to shutter closed once more, brick by careful brick, exactly as it had been before she ever arrived at Ravenshallow Hall. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice distant again, formal in a way that struck her harder than any argument could have. "Please excuse me, Eliza." She left the study with tears streaming freely down her face, retreating to her own chambers, where she sat by the cold hearth long into the night, replaying every word of the cruel, fabricated letter, trying to understand how Margaret had managed to craft something so precisely designed to strike at Adrian's deepest, oldest wounds. It was not merely cruelty, Eliza realized slowly. It was calculated, deliberate, built by someone who understood exactly which fears would prove most damaging, and that thought frightened her more than the letter itself. In the days that followed, Ravenshallow Hall grew colder than Eliza had ever known it, even in those first lonely weeks of their marriage. Adrian retreated fully back into his study, taking his meals alone once more, his scarred face turned carefully away whenever their paths crossed in the halls. He was not cruel, never that, but the careful, guarded distance had returned in full force, and Eliza found herself grieving the loss of their newfound closeness as sharply as any physical wound. Mrs. Bellamy noticed the change immediately, her own expression carrying deep worry each time she looked between them. "Something has happened, my lady," she said gently one afternoon, finding Eliza sitting alone in the garden, staring blankly at the roses she had worked so hard to restore. "The whole house feels it. My stepmother has poisoned him against me," Eliza said quietly. "With lies so carefully crafted, I do not know how to prove their falseness." "Then you must find proof," Mrs. Bellamy said firmly, settling beside her on the garden bench. "His Grace is a fair man, my lady, whatever old wounds cloud his judgment just now. He will listen to truth if you can bring him truth solid enough to stand against her lies." Eliza turned the housekeeper's words over carefully in her mind through the long, lonely evening that followed. Margaret had forged her father's signature on false debt papers already, papers that Adrian's solicitor had been quietly investigating these past weeks without conclusive results yet. If she could prove that forgery definitively, perhaps it would cast enough doubt on the cruel letter as well, enough to make Adrian question whether Margaret's word could be trusted at all. She wrote to her father's old solicitor that very night, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Whitfield, who had managed the Harrington family's affairs for over 20 years and had always shown Eliza genuine warmth and respect, unlike so many others who had abandoned her once her father passed. She explained the situation carefully, asking whether he might have any records that could definitively prove the debt papers false, any correspondence or accounts that showed her father's true financial standing at the time of his death. His reply arrived within the week, carrying news that made Eliza's heart leap with cautious hope. Mr. Whitfield confirmed that he possessed complete, certified records of her father's estate at the time of his passing, records that showed no outstanding debts whatsoever, records that had been properly filed with the courts and could not have been altered or forged in the years since. More than that, he offered to travel to Ravenshallow personally, to present the evidence directly and answer any questions the Duke might have. Eliza requested an audience with Adrian that same evening, finding him once more in his study, though this time she did not wait for his invitation before speaking. "I have written to my father's solicitor," she said firmly, standing in the doorway with a determination she had not felt since the day she accepted his marriage proposal. "Mr. Whitfield holds complete certified records of my father's estate. He confirms there were no debts, Adrian, none whatsoever. The papers my stepmother sent you are forgeries, and I intend to prove it beyond any doubt." Adrian looked up from his desk, something flickering across his guarded expression, surprise perhaps, or the faint stirring of old hope he had not allowed himself to feel these past difficult days. "You would go to such lengths." "I would go to any length to prove my honesty to you," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "Because I love you, Adrian, and I refuse to let my stepmother's cruelty destroy what we have built together, not without a fight." Something in his expression softened, just slightly, the old warmth flickering faintly beneath the careful walls he had rebuilt these past days. "I have been unfair to you," he admitted quietly. "I let old fears speak louder than the truth I have witnessed with my own eyes these past months. I am sorry, Eliza." "I understand why," she said gently, crossing the room to kneel beside his chair once more, just as she had that stormy night weeks ago. "Your fears did not come from nothing, Adrian." but I need you to trust what we have built together over what my stepmother has tried to destroy." "I do trust it," he said, reaching for her hand, holding it firmly this time, without hesitation. "I trust you, Eliza. I should have trusted you from the very first moment, rather than letting old wounds cloud my judgment even briefly." Relief flooded through her chest, warm and fierce, though a small, cautious voice reminded her that Margaret would not simply retreat now that her first true weapon had failed to strike as deeply as intended. Whatever came next would likely prove more dangerous still, and Eliza understood, watching Adrian's face soften back into the warmth she had grown to love these past months, that they would need to face it together fully, with nothing hidden between them, if they hoped to survive whatever Margaret intended to try next. 3 days later, Mr. Whitfield arrived at Ravenshallow Hall as promised, carrying a thick folder of certified documents that laid bare the truth of Margaret's forgery beyond any reasonable doubt. Adrian's own solicitor examined the papers alongside him, confirming that the signature on Margaret's debt documents did not match Harold Harrington's true hand in several critical details, subtle inconsistencies that a careful forger had nearly, but not quite, managed to disguise. "This is more than enough to expose her," Adrian said grimly, studying the evidence spread across his desk. "Forgery is a serious crime, Eliza. If we present this properly, your stepmother could face genuine legal consequence for what she has done." "I do not care about punishing her for its own sake," Eliza said honestly. "I only want her lies to stop reaching us. I want to build a life here with you without her shadow constantly threatening to destroy it." "Then we shall ensure both," Adrian said firmly. "We will expose the truth publicly enough that she can never attempt something like this again, and in doing so, we protect our future together completely." But even as they made their careful plans, neither of them yet understood the full extent of what Margaret had been building these past weeks, debts of her own mounting far beyond anything Eliza knew about, desperate financial pressures pushing her toward increasingly reckless schemes. The forged papers and cruel letter had been only the opening moves of a much larger, more dangerous plan, one final desperate gambit that Margaret intended to play soon, regardless of the cost to anyone standing in her way. A carriage overturned on the London road just past midnight, and though no one aboard suffered serious harm, the frightened driver's account of what he witnessed would soon set off a chain of events that neither Eliza nor Margaret could have fully predicted. The driver, employed by a moneylender named Mr. Croft, had been transporting his employer home from a late meeting when a figure darted suddenly into the road, causing the horses to rear and the carriage to tip dangerously onto its side. The figure, it turned out, was a young maid fleeing Margaret's townhouse in genuine terror, carrying with her a small bundle of letters she had discovered while cleaning her mistress's private desk. Letters that revealed far more than Margaret had ever intended anyone outside her household to see. The maid, a frightened girl named Polly who had served in the Harrington household for less than a year, arrived at Ravenshallow Hall 3 days later, having heard through servants' gossip that the young Duchess might offer her protection from a mistress she now feared deeply. Eliza received her personally in the small sitting room, offering tea and warm reassurance until the girl's trembling finally eased enough to speak clearly. "I did not mean to read them, Your Grace," Polly said, twisting her hands anxiously in her lap. "I was only tidying the desk and one had fallen open, and I could not help but see the words. When I understood what they were, I knew I could not stay silent, whatever the risk to myself." She produced the small bundle of letters, and Eliza's hands trembled as she began reading through them, Adrian standing close behind her chair, reading over her shoulder with growing, grim understanding. The letters revealed a plan far more calculated and dangerous than either of them had imagined. Margaret had not only forged the debt papers and fabricated the cruel letter about Eliza's supposed mockery, but had also been in direct correspondence with Lord Pemberton since before the winter ball, arranging the original scheme in explicit detail, promising him a portion of the Harrington fortune once Eliza's ruin forced her into a marriage Margaret could control. More damning still, the letters revealed Margaret's mounting debts, gambling losses and reckless spending that had left her townhouse itself at risk of seizure. Debts she had hoped to solve entirely through controlling Eliza's inheritance, first through forced ruin, and then, when that plan failed unexpectedly, through the false accusations meant to destroy the marriage from within instead. "This is proof enough to end her schemes permanently," Adrian said grimly, setting the letters carefully aside. "Forgery, extortion, and conspiracy to ruin a young woman's reputation for financial gain. These are serious crimes, Eliza, regardless of her relation to you." "I know," Eliza said quietly, though something in her chest still ached at the thought, some small, sad remnant of the daughter who had once hoped, foolishly, that her stepmother might someday show genuine warmth rather than calculated cruelty. "But I would rather confront her directly first, Adrian, before involving the courts. She is still my father's widow. I owe him that much consideration even now." Adrian studied her for a long moment, respect and concern warring visibly across his features. "Then I will come with you," he said firmly. "You will not face her alone again, Eliza." "Not this time." They traveled to London together 3 days later, arriving at Margaret's townhouse unannounced on a gray, overcast afternoon. Margaret received them in her drawing room with visible surprise quickly masked beneath practiced composure, though Eliza noticed the slight tremor in her stepmother's hands as she gestured them toward seats they did not take. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying its usual honeyed charm, though something brittle had crept into its edges. "We know everything," Eliza said simply, setting the bundle of letters on the table between them. "The forged debt papers, the false accusations sent to my husband, your original arrangement with Lord Pemberton before the winter ball. We have proof of all of it, Margaret, in your own handwriting." The color drained from Margaret's face as she stared at the letters, recognition and fear flickering rapidly behind her carefully composed expression. "I do not know what you imagine you have found," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Do not insult us with further lies," Adrian said, his voice cold and steady, carrying the full weight of a duke long accustomed to command, though Eliza noticed he kept his tone measured rather than cruel. "We have spoken with Polly. We have examined the letters closely. We have consulted with legal counsel regarding the severity of what you have attempted. You forged documents, Lady Margaret. You conspired to ruin an innocent young woman for financial gain. You have spent months attempting to destroy a marriage through deliberate, calculated lies. These are not accusations. These are documented facts." Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely, years of carefully maintained charm collapsing into raw, desperate fear. "You do not understand the position I have been in," she said, her voice rising sharply. "My husband left nothing behind for me directly, only for Eliza, tied up in trust until her marriage. I had my own daughters to think of, their futures to secure. What was I meant to do, watch us all fall into poverty while Eliza inherited everything?" "You could have shown kindness instead of cruelty," Eliza said quietly, more sorrow than anger coloring her voice now. "You could have treated me as a daughter rather than an obstacle, Margaret. I would have shared willingly, had you ever once shown genuine warmth rather than calculation. Instead you chose forgery and lies, and a scheme that nearly destroyed both my reputation and my marriage. Those were your choices, not circumstances forced upon you." "What do you intend to do now?" Margaret asked, her voice small and frightened in a way Eliza had never heard from her before. Eliza glanced at Adrian, some silent understanding passing between them before she answered. "We will not pursue criminal charges," she said finally, watching relief flood briefly across Margaret's pale face before she continued. "Provided you sign a formal statement acknowledging the forgery and false accusations, retracting every lie you have spread publicly, and agree never to attempt further harm against myself, my husband, or this marriage. Vivian and Clara's inheritance from my father's estate, the small portion he left them independent of my own trust, remains untouched regardless of your actions. They are innocent in this, whatever their mother has done." "And if I refuse?" Margaret asked, some last flicker of defiance rising despite her obvious fear. "Then the full evidence goes before the courts," Adrian said flatly, "and you will face whatever consequence the law determines appropriate for forgery and conspiracy, without further mercy from either of us." Margaret's shoulders sagged, defeat settling visibly over her features as she recognized, finally, that she held no further leverage against them. "I will sign your statement," she said quietly, all trace of her earlier charm and fury drained away entirely, leaving only weary, bitter resignation behind. The formal document was drawn up and signed within the hour, witnessed by Adrian's solicitor, and sealed properly according to law. As they prepared to leave, Margaret spoke once more, her voice carrying an unfamiliar rawness Eliza had never heard from her before. "I never hated you, Eliza," she said quietly, staring at her own hands rather than meeting Eliza's gaze. "I envied you. Your father loved you so completely, so effortlessly, in a way he never quite managed for my own daughters, however hard I tried to earn it for them. I told myself that made my actions justified somehow. I see now that it did not." Eliza studied her stepmother for a long, quiet moment, old hurt and unexpected sympathy tangling together in her chest. "I hope you find some peace eventually, Margaret," she said finally, "though I cannot pretend I will grieve the distance between us going forward. Some wounds simply need time and space to heal, if they heal at all." They left the townhouse together, Adrian's hand finding hers as they stepped out into the gray London afternoon, and Eliza felt, for the first time in many months, the true and complete lifting of a weight she had carried since her father's death. Whatever came next, however Margaret's public disgrace unfolded once word inevitably spread through society, Eliza understood that the greatest danger to her marriage and her happiness had finally, truly, been laid to rest. "You did not have to show her mercy," Adrian said quietly as their carriage began the journey home to Ravenshallow. "After everything she attempted against you." "I know," Eliza said, resting her head against his shoulder as the London streets gave way slowly to open countryside. "But I did not wish to carry more bitterness forward into our life together than necessary, Adrian. I would rather build our future on something other than revenge." He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his arm wrapping securely around her shoulders. "Then we shall build it on whatever foundation you choose," he said softly. "I trust your judgment completely, Eliza, in this and everything else." As their carriage carried them home through the darkening countryside, Eliza allowed herself, finally, to imagine a future entirely free of Margaret's shadow. A future built instead on the quiet, hard-won love she and Adrian had discovered together, strong enough now to withstand whatever challenges still lay ahead of them. Word of Margaret's disgrace spread through London society faster than either Eliza or Adrian had anticipated, though not through any deliberate effort of their own. It began, as such things often did, with a single whispered conversation at a card party, someone who had heard from someone else that Lady Margaret Harrington had been forced to sign a formal confession admitting to forgery and conspiracy. Within a fortnight, the story had grown and spread through every drawing room and gentlemen's club in the city, embellished with each retelling until it bore only passing resemblance to the truth, though the core of it remained accurate enough. Margaret had schemed against her own stepdaughter for financial gain, and the scheme had been thoroughly, publicly exposed. The consequences arrived swiftly. Invitations that had once flowed steadily to Margaret's townhouse dried up entirely within weeks. Old friends who had once fawned over her company now crossed the street rather than acknowledge her in passing. Lord Pemberton, upon learning of the exposed correspondence implicating him in the original scheme, fled to the continent rather than face the scandal directly, his own reputation crumbling in his absence. Margaret found herself, within a single season, transformed from a respected society widow into a cautionary tale, whispered about at every gathering she was no longer welcome to attend. Eliza felt little satisfaction in witnessing her stepmother's downfall, though she felt considerable relief that the woman's capacity to harm anyone further had been thoroughly, permanently removed. She made certain, quietly and without fanfare, that a portion of her own considerable allowance continued reaching Vivian and Clara directly, ensuring the sisters were not made to suffer entirely for their mother's crimes. though she maintained careful distance from Margaret herself going forward, exactly as she had promised. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself unexpectedly drawn back into society for the first time in 7 years, though not by his own choosing initially. Word of his marriage, and more particularly of the courage and loyalty Eliza had shown throughout the entire ordeal, had transformed public perception of him almost as dramatically as it had transformed perception of Margaret. Where once he had been whispered about as the reclusive, frightening beast of Ravenshallow, he was increasingly spoken of as a man of quiet honor, someone who had offered marriage to protect an innocent woman's reputation and found genuine love in the process. A story society found itself unexpectedly charmed by, however much Adrian himself remained uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "I never wished for any of this," he admitted one evening, reading through yet another invitation to a society dinner that had arrived that week, his expression carrying equal parts amusement and old wariness. "For years, I preferred to be forgotten entirely." "You do not have to accept any of them," Eliza said gently, settling beside him on the study settee, her hand finding his without hesitation. "Whatever society now thinks of you, Adrian, your comfort matters more to me than their curiosity." He studied the invitation a moment longer before setting it aside with a small, thoughtful smile. "Perhaps a few," he said slowly, "not out of obligation to satisfy their curiosity, but because I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer wish to hide entirely from the world, not with you beside me." They attended a handful of careful, selected gatherings over the following months, Adrian standing tall and unflinching beside Eliza at each one, his scarred face turned openly toward candlelight rather than shadow, no longer the frightened, guarded man who had hidden away at Ravenshallow Hall for 7 long years. Eliza watched with quiet pride as he slowly rediscovered comfort in company he had once avoided entirely, his dry wit emerging more readily with each outing old friends from his youth, gradually re-establishing connections he had let lapse during his years of solitary grief. At one particular gathering, hosted by an old family friend of Adrian's late mother, Eliza overheard 2 elderly ladies discussing the couple in hushed, admiring tones near the refreshment table, clearly unaware she stood close enough to hear. "Did you ever imagine it?" one whispered to the other. "The beast of Ravenshallow, transformed so completely. I have not seen him smile so freely in all the years I have known his family." "It is her doing entirely," the other replied. "You can see it in the way he looks at her. I have never witnessed a man so thoroughly, obviously in love." Eliza smiled quietly to herself, warmth spreading through her chest at the simple, honest truth of the observation. Whatever cruel gossip had once surrounded them both, whatever schemes Margaret had crafted to destroy their happiness, none of it had succeeded in the end. If anything, surviving those trials together had only strengthened the bond between them, forging something far more resilient than either of them might have found through an easier, more conventional courtship. Back at Ravenshallow Hall, life settled into a warm, contented rhythm neither Eliza nor Adrian had truly believed possible for themselves before their unexpected marriage. The restored gardens bloomed fully that spring, roses climbing thick and fragrant along the paths Adrian's mother had once walked. The neglected grounds transformed gradually into something vibrant and alive once more. Mrs. Bellamy oversaw a household that had grown noticeably livelier, warmer, filled with easy laughter that had been entirely absent during the long, lonely years before Eliza's arrival. One quiet evening in early summer, Adrian led Eliza to the locked door at the end of the West Wing corridor, the one she had asked about so many months ago, Edmund's untouched room, sealed away behind its heavy curtain since the fire. "I think it is time," he said quietly, producing an old key from his pocket, his hand steady despite the visible emotion in his eyes. "I have kept this room locked for 7 years, as though preserving it exactly as it was might somehow keep him closer to me. I understand now that grief does not work that way. Love does not require a locked, dusty room to survive." Together, they opened the door and stepped inside, dust motes drifting golden in the evening light through curtains that had not been opened in 7 long years. The room held simple, ordinary things, a young man's books and belongings undisturbed since the night of the fire, and Eliza felt the weight of old grief settle briefly over both of them as they stood together in the quiet space. "I would like to restore this room," Adrian said slowly, "not to erase what happened here, but to honor Edmund's memory properly, the way you helped me honor my mother's gardens. Perhaps turn it into a proper library, filled with books he would have loved reading himself. Somewhere his memory can live warmly, rather than gathering dust behind a locked door." "I think that is a beautiful idea," Eliza said softly, squeezing his hand gently. "He would be glad, I think, to know his memory brings warmth into this house again, rather than sorrow alone." They spent the following weeks restoring the room together, carefully preserving Edmund's most treasured belongings while opening the space to new light and life, filling empty shelves with books both old and new, transforming a place of frozen grief into something that honored the past while embracing the future fully. When the work was finally complete, Adrian stood in the doorway of the transformed room, sunlight streaming freely through windows that had remained shuttered for 7 long years. And Eliza watched something settle finally, peacefully, in his expression. Old grief eased at last into something gentler, more bearable. "Thank you," he said quietly, turning to face her fully, "for everything you have brought into this house, Eliza, into my life. I do not know that I would have found my way back to any of this without you." "You would have found your way eventually," Eliza said gently. "I merely happened to be walking beside you when you did." That evening, they dined together in the main hall as had become their comfortable custom, candlelight flickering warmly between them, no empty chairs stretching cold and unused down the long table any longer, simply the two of them, content and easy in each other's company. Adrian raised his glass toward her partway through the meal, something warm and playful lighting his scarred features in a way that had become increasingly familiar these past months. "To the woman who thanked the darkness for putting me in her path," he said, "and taught me in return that light was worth returning to fully after all." Eliza raised her own glass, tears of happiness gathering unbidden in her eyes. "To the man who chased shadows away from a frightened girl in his conservatory, and gave her in return a home and a love she never dared imagine finding." They drank together, laughing softly at the simple, sincere sentiment of it, and outside the tall windows of Ravenshallow Hall, the summer evening settled gold and warm across gardens now blooming fully after years of neglect, much like the two hearts that had found their way, against every obstacle placed deliberately in their path, toward a love neither of them had ever expected to find, yet both now understood they could not imagine living without. Margaret's cruel schemes, meant to secure Eliza's ruin and Margaret's own continued comfort, had instead delivered her stepdaughter directly into a life richer and more genuinely happy than anything Margaret herself had ever managed to build through calculation and deceit. The stepmother who had planned Eliza's downfall had, through her own cruelty, given her instead the very thing Eliza had longed for since her father's death, a true home, and a love built not on obligation or fortune, but on genuine trust, courage, and the quiet, steady kindness that had first drawn a frightened girl safely out of the darkness of a winter garden, and into the light of a conservatory where two broken, guarded hearts had finally, unexpectedly, begun to heal each other completely. 2 years passed, and Ravenshallow Hall no longer resembled the quiet, shadowed house Eliza had first arrived at as a nervous young bride. The nursery at the end of the east corridor, freshly painted and filled with soft morning light, held a small wooden cradle that Adrian himself had helped choose, insisting on testing its sturdiness so thoroughly that Mrs. Bellamy had teased him for a full week afterward. Their daughter, a bright, curious child named Rose, after the gardens that had brought her parents so quietly together, had been born the previous autumn, and she had already learned to reach eagerly for her father's scarred hand whenever he lifted her, showing not the slightest hesitation that so many strangers once had. "She has your eyes," Eliza said one afternoon, watching Adrian walk slowly through the restored gardens with their daughter balanced carefully against his shoulder, pointing out each blooming rose with quiet, patient explanations the infant could not yet understand but clearly enjoyed regardless. "She has your stubbornness," Adrian replied, laughing as Rose grabbed insistently at a low-hanging bloom, refusing to be redirected toward a different flower. "I recognize that particular determination quite well by now." Life at Ravenshallow had settled into something Eliza had once believed impossible for herself. A home filled genuinely with warmth and laughter rather than fear and careful silence. Adrian had grown steadily more comfortable in society these past 2 years, no longer avoiding gatherings entirely, though he still preferred the quiet company of his own family and closest friends above the wider curiosity of London's drawing rooms. He had taken to inviting old friends and their families to Ravenshallow instead, the great house filling with the sound of children's laughter and easy conversation, in a way it had not known since long before the fire that once nearly destroyed everything he held dear. Edmund's restored library had become Adrian's favorite room in the entire house, filled now with books both old and newly purchased. A small portrait of his younger brother hung prominently above the mantel, painted from an old sketch Adrian had commissioned specially, showing Edmund laughing exactly as Adrian remembered him best. He spent quiet evenings there often, sometimes reading aloud to Rose as she grew older, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence with Eliza beside him. The old grief finally settled into something gentler, a warm remembrance rather than a wound that refused to heal. Mr. Whitfield visited regularly from London, delighted to see the young woman he had known since childhood so thoroughly happy and secure, and he brought news occasionally of Vivian and Clara, who had both eventually married respectably, their own small inheritances from their father having provided enough security to build modest, contented lives entirely separate from their mother's continuing disgrace. Margaret herself had retreated quietly to a small cottage in the countryside, her once considerable social standing entirely diminished, though Eliza heard, through occasional careful correspondence with her stepsisters, that she had grown notably humbler with age, tending a small garden of her own with what Vivian described as surprising, genuine dedication. Eliza felt no particular satisfaction in her stepmother's diminished circumstances, only a quiet, settled peace in knowing that the woman's capacity to harm her family further had been thoroughly removed, replaced instead by a life built entirely on her own terms, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and valued her. On a warm evening in early summer, exactly 3 years after that first fateful winter ball, Adrian and Eliza walked together through the fully restored gardens, Rose toddling unsteadily between them, one small hand clutched in each of theirs, laughing delightedly every time they lifted her briefly off the ground between steps. The roses bloomed thick and fragrant along every path, exactly as Adrian's mother had once tended them, exactly as Eliza had first restored them during those careful, quiet early weeks of their marriage. "Do you remember," Eliza said softly, watching the golden evening light spill across the gardens, "what you told me that first night we spoke properly in the conservatory?" "I remember every word of it," Adrian said, smiling in the easy, unguarded way that had become entirely natural to him now. "I told you that I preferred the dark, that it suited me better than candlelight." "And now?" Eliza asked, though she already knew his answer, had known it for the past 3 happy years of their life together. "Now," Adrian said, lifting Rose easily onto his shoulders as she squealed with delighted laughter, "I find I prefer the light considerably more, provided you and our daughter remain standing within it beside me." Eliza leaned against him, content and complete in a way she had never dared imagine possible during those cold, lonely months following her father's death, when Margaret's cruelty had seemed like it might define the entire remainder of her life. Instead, that darkest chapter had led her, through circumstances neither planned nor expected, directly into a conservatory on a winter night, and from there, slowly and carefully, into a love built on genuine trust, courage, and quiet, steady kindness that had healed them both completely. The scarred Duke of Ravenshallow, once whispered about as a frightening recluse hiding from the world, had become instead a beloved husband and father, his old grief transformed gradually into gentle remembrance rather than isolating shame. The unwanted stepdaughter, once treated as little more than a servant in her own childhood home, had become a duchess whose quiet strength and genuine warmth had restored an entire household to life, proving that the cruelty meant to destroy her had instead delivered her directly into the very happiness she had always deserved, but never dared believe she might actually find. As the sun set fully behind the restored gardens of Ravenshallow Hall, casting long golden shadows across roses that bloomed now more fully than they had in over a decade, Eliza understood completely that whatever ruin her stepmother had once planned so carefully against her, fate itself had chosen a very different path entirely, one that led not toward destruction, but toward a love neither she nor Adrian had ever truly expected to find, and now could not imagine living without.